This is Kenny McCormick, who has the worst luck of anyone in the history of South Park. But what if he's actually just been dead the whole time? Let's go back in time for a second. It's August 13, 1997, and Comedy Central is airing the very first episode of South Park. Cartman gets an probe. For the first time, the world meets these four foul-mouthed kids, Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Cartman, in their sleepy mountain town. The episode is all about UFOs and abductions, and Cartman's claim that aliens play around with his ass. But we don't really need to focus on any of that right now, because what's important is, towards the end of this episode, something happens that immediately changes the dynamic of the entire show. Up to this point, it's all been butt jokes and curse words and Chef singing about making love to a woman by the fire. But then suddenly Kenny is blasted by the UFO, and he's dead. Or he seems to be dead. He isn't. But just as he stands up, a herd of cattle runs him down, and he still isn't dead. But then a police car just speeds right over his body and kills him. That one, to be fair, is pretty common for America. But after all of that, Cartman just goes home and abandons his dying friend, which again, classic America. This is the first in at least 127 scenes featuring Kenny meeting some kind of brutal end. It was the moment that set the tone for everything that would come. That the show isn't just about kids cursing and talking about and violence and Tom Cruise being trapped in the closet. It's also about the repeated and totally casual murder or accidental death of a kid, which nobody cares about whatsoever. We're not supposed to, but anyone who's been on a plane with a kid or knows someone who has a kid, well, we're not entirely mad about it. In almost every single episode of the first 5 seasons, Kenny dies, but then he comes back as though nothing ever happened. Until it just suddenly stopped. Kenny started surviving, which was a bummer for those of us who wanted the kid to keep dying. But probably a good thing that red flag's been taken away. There are a lot of theories as to why exactly Kenny stopped dying, but I'm gonna focus on the one I keep coming back to. The entire show is just Kenny's coma fantasy. Yeah, even Cartman. Because even on the brink of death, this kid has to be punished by being around a fat, loud-mouthed, insufferable little brat who sadly is not the one to die repeatedly. There is an episode in season 14 called Mysterion Rises, which is all about the big reveal of the superhero known as Mysterion. And everybody has their own ideas of who this guy could be. But there's one person that nobody ever suspects. Yeah, you guessed it, Kenny McCormick. The episode reveals that Kenny was born as Mysterion, and he has the unique gift of immortality. Every time he dies, he just comes back like nothing ever happened. It actually sounds like a nightmare to be trapped in a Groundhog Day loop with Eric Cartman. That's how school shootings start. But then he starts telling his friends about this and how he dies over and over again, and explains why he's never hurt when it happens in front of them. And none of them have any idea what he's talking about. He's telling them all about his electrocutions, being run down, burned to death, dying from a tampon shoved up his, you get the picture, but they have no idea what he's talking about. None of them have any memory at any point of Kenny dying in front of them, or even in their lives generally, ever. Which is nuts because it was happening literally every single episode. Maybe they're just really into watching him die. Everybody has their kinks, I guess. So Kenny believes he has to do something to show them and prove to them that this happens. And he shoots himself to death. He actually repeats several times over the next few episodes, and he seems disturbingly good at it. Now there are episodes that kind of undermine this. There's the episode Cartman Land, which suggests that Cartman actually does remember a lot, if not all of Kenny's deaths. He just chooses to ignore them because there's no personal benefit to him acknowledging them. Which is a very Cartman thing to do, because he's an But if Kenny's in a coma, that's irrelevant, because it means the whole show is from Kenny's point of view. And that's where we find ourselves now. There are 2 options here. Either this is all real and Kenny dies every episode and just comes back into a new universe with new versions of the same people, who genuinely do not recall seeing Kenny die because it wasn't their Kenny. You know, the usual overly complicated, messy, and generally unsatisfying multiverse garbage. Or he's in a coma and just making the whole thing up, also unsatisfying, but more logical, and there is some context in the show that would make it make sense. From the very beginning, South Park has shown that Kenny comes from a seriously troubled family, one of the poorest in all of South Park, and every time we see his parents, the red flags just go up. They're unstable alcoholics and occasional drug users who can often be found attending cult meetings just for the chance to score some free booze, or probably sell their kid. Maybe these guys are orchestrating the murders on their own son just to cash in on the insurance. It could happen. They also feed their children frozen waffles with no side dishes or vegetables and bread sandwiches for breakfast. It's not a healthy living situation, and you could easily see how Kenny would be wishing for death instead of yet another breakfast made of triple complex carbohydrates. Even Kenny's behavior has the telltale signs of abuse or bullying. Some people say Kenny is just shy, that he gets nervous around people and wants to hide. But the way that he covers most of his face and prevents his words from being heard properly suggests that he's just afraid of being seen or heard, that he thinks he'll get attacked for it, or shot, or electrocuted, or that he'll have a tampon shoved up his ass. Actually, that last one might not be bullying. Someone might be trying to help him prepare for a future life in prison, or when he transitions. Basically, kids suck. And I think all of us know that it's highly likely someone like Kenny, who comes from an unhealthy and poor family, will be picked on by his peers for it. Every time we see Kenny get emotional or afraid on the show, he just pulls on his strings and covers his face even more, which does suggest that he's doing this to hide from the world or to protect himself when he goes and performs a suicide bomb. But that's not really an American thing, I guess. But let's go back to that Mysterion Rises episode. So we see that moment where none of the kids believe Kenny when he says he dies over and over again, and we know that he shoots himself to prove it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, as an American preteen, he's pretty comfortable with the idea of shooting a gun near school kids. So what if this was real? What if this is where the whole coma began? This episode happens pretty late into the series. We're in season 14 by this point, so we can't argue that it's chronological. But South Park has done a lot of distinctly out there, fantastical episodes where the boys are ninjas and superheroes and anime warriors, and eventually black women. So what if this is just a slightly juiced up version of how Kenny got into the coma? Let's put it all together. So Kenny is a typical school kid living in the small Colorado town of South Park. His mom is almost definitely going down on cult members for booze and or money, and his family is poor because she's probably not good at it. But Kenny's bullied by the other kids because of it. Because he's poor, because he eats bread for breakfast, and because his favorite meal is a frozen waffle. All of that is like a gift for bullies. His mom is probably a gift too, depending on how much she charged. So Kenny's pushed to his limit, and he doesn't have the confidence to push back or defend himself. And over time, he just has a full-on psychotic breakdown. He disappears into this other being for protection, Mistreated, a superhero who cannot die. Every day, Kenny is bullied, but he envisions himself dying, and Mistreated always pulls him back from the brink as the one guy who doesn't want to bully, abuse, murder, berate, or otherwise take advantage of him. So Kenny thinks he's a superhero born with immortality, but in reality, he's just disassociating from the real world. One day, he gets so tired of trying to explain this to his friends, who don't believe he's a superhero, that he tries to show them. He tries to prove that he's been dying over and over again by pulling a gun and shooting himself. But he doesn't die. Unlike many preteens, he's a pretty terrible shot, so he just lands himself in a coma. Now he's unconscious and on life support, and it's freeing. In this limbo world, there's nothing to bully him. He can be whoever he wants, do anything he wants. But what he really longs for more than anything isn't money or a better family. He just wants a life with his best friends, so he goes back there over and over, revisiting all the good times he had with Stan, Kyle, and Cartman, and inventing new ones, where they're ninjas or superheroes or wizards. They don't have to grow up, they can just keep having fun, keep playing video games, and keep injuring one another to the brink of death and beyond. Because Cartman deserves to be dead, honestly. And because this is all in Kenny's head, he can truly be whatever he wants to be. So he's super smart, the smartest. He speaks multiple languages, he's skilled with an unthinkable amount of weapons, he knows more about sex than any of the other kids, but he probably doesn't know where the G-spot is. He's a gaming genius, he's musically talented, skilled at sports and athletics, he's pretty much great at everything, and the future is bright. He's a Nobel Prize winning scientist. Now, none of this makes any kind of sense if you just take the show at face value. If you view Kenny as an ordinary 9-year-old boy, it doesn't make sense why he would be so gifted with weapons besides guns. Because he's American, or how he speaks so many languages. because he's American. But when you look at the show from his perspective, thinking of it as if he exists in a world of his own creation, a coma where anything can be possible, it makes so much sense. Of course he's a genius. Of course he's great with women. Of course he doesn't ever have to take his hood off in any given situation. Kenny is in a coma, and it's the happiest he's ever been. Now we just have to work on the other three. What do you think? Do you think Kenny's alive and well, albeit maimed, or do you buy into this idea that Kenny is actually just living out a great life in the middle of an uncertain limbo?